"Did you hear?" whispered the woman in the emerald gown, her champagne flute barely brushing her lips. "Vincent Layton is bringing his mistress tonight." Margaret Layton stood on the mezzanine overlooking the grand ballroom, her fingers tightening imperceptibly around the stem of her own glass. She didn't flinch, didn't allow the venom of the rumor to crack the surface of her composure. She only smiled, a small, measured expression that conveyed nothing. To react would be to admit the unthinkable, that her husband, the man she had built her life and reputation around, would dare bring his indiscretion into their home. The gala was the pinnacle of her year, an event that solidified her place in the city's elite social circles. Every detail had been carefully curated, the white roses draped across the banisters, the gleaming crystal chandeliers casting a golden glow, the impeccably dressed guests mingling beneath them. This was her domain, the stage she had crafted to perfection. Margaret turned toward the source of the whisper, two women huddled near the bar, their heads close together like conspirators. They hadn't noticed her standing just a few feet away, or if they had, they didn't care. She was used to that. People loved a scandal, and she was its unwitting centerpiece. The clink of crystal and the low hum of conversation swirled around her, but her focus remained sharp. He wouldn't. He couldn't. "Mrs. Layton?" A young server approached her tentatively, holding out a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Margaret blinked, forcing herself back into the moment. "Thank you," she said, taking a canapé she had no intention of eating. She offered the boy a warm smile, one of the many small acts that earned her the affection of the staff. They were the only people here who didn't expect her to be invincible. Still, her mind raced. Vincent had been distant for months, his excuses piling up like unopened mail. Business trips, late meetings, a sudden obsession with golf, despite never having shown an interest before. She wasn't naive. She had sensed something shifting, like a hairline crack in a porcelain vase. But this? To flaunt another woman at her event? It was unthinkable, even for him. A burst of laughter erupted near the entrance, drawing her attention. Margaret turned and saw her assistant, Claire, hurrying toward her with an expression that could only be described as braced, the kind of look people wear when they're about to deliver bad news. "Margaret," Claire began in a low voice, her hands clasped in front of her. "Vincent just arrived." Margaret's throat tightened. "And?" Claire hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "He's not alone." There it was. The confirmation she hadn't wanted, but had been preparing for since the first whisper reached her ears. Margaret's grip on her glass remained steady as she set it on the tray of a passing waiter. "Where is he?" Claire nodded toward the grand staircase at the far end of the room. "He's just coming in now." Margaret squared her shoulders and moved toward the staircase, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The crowd parted subtly as she walked, the respect she commanded evident even among those who fed off the drama of her life. She reached the base of the stairs just as Vincent descended, his hand resting lightly on the arm of a stunning young woman in a red dress. The room seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's eyes swept over them with surgical precision. Vincent, handsome and smug in his tailored tuxedo, appeared utterly unbothered by the charged atmosphere. The woman, no girl beside him, couldn't have been more than 25. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her crimson dress clung to her like a second skin. She was striking, yes, but in the brittle, temporary way of a flower cut too soon. "Margaret," Vincent said smoothly, his voice carrying just enough warmth to seem polite. "You look radiant, as always." Her smile didn't falter. "Vincent." She allowed her gaze to linger on the girl, whose confidence seemed to falter under her scrutiny. "And this must be Elena," the girl said quickly, extending a hand. Her voice was soft, unsure, like a child's. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Layton." Margaret ignored the hand. "Charming," she said, her tone neutral. "I trust Vincent has explained the nature of tonight's event." Eleanor blinked, clearly thrown. Vincent's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he didn't speak. "This gala is the culmination of months of work," Margaret continued, her voice smooth but edged with steel. "The Layton Foundation's most important fundraiser of the year. I'd hate for anything to disrupt its success." Elena flushed, her hand dropping to her side. "Of course, I didn't mean—" "Don't worry," Vincent cut in, his tone firm. "Eleanor is here as my guest. Nothing more." Margaret's gaze flicked to him, sharp as a blade. "Your guest. In my house." "Well," she said, her smile returning. "Let's make sure she enjoys herself then." With that she turned and walked away, leaving Vincent and Eleanor standing at the foot of the staircase. Her heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. There was a long night ahead, and she would not let them see her crack. The whispers followed her as she moved through the crowd, but she welcomed them now. Let them talk, let them speculate. The longer they stared at her, the less they looked at him. Margaret Leighton had spent years perfecting the art of survival. Tonight would be no different. The murmurs followed Margaret like shadows, trailing her as she moved gracefully through the ballroom. Guests leaned into one another, whispering behind their champagne flutes, their eyes darting toward the grand staircase. Every so often, Margaret would catch a stray fragment of conversation, snippets of shock, judgment, and thinly veiled delight at the unfolding scandal. "Can you believe he'd do that here?" Poor Margaret, the humiliation. Do you think she knew? Margaret's smile remained firmly in place, her posture immaculate. She glided through the crowd, pausing here and there to exchange pleasantries, each interaction a calculated move in the delicate game of appearances. To the untrained eye, she seemed unshaken, the epitome of poise, but inside, she was calculating, planning her next steps, like a chess master faced with an unexpected gambit. She reached the edge of the room where the French doors opened onto the expansive terrace. The cool evening air beckoned, but she resisted the urge to escape. This was her battlefield, and she wouldn't abandon it. Not yet. "Margaret!" A familiar voice called out, warm and tinged with concern. She turned to see Evelyn Sinclair, one of her oldest friends, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne in hand. Evelyn's face was a mix of sympathy and resolve, her perfectly styled silver hair glinting under the chandeliers. She pressed one of the glasses into Margaret's hand. "I thought you might need reinforcements," Evelyn said, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. "Do I look like I need them?" Margaret replied lightly, taking a small sip of champagne. The bubbles danced on her tongue, a welcome distraction from the tension coiling in her chest. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze flicking toward the staircase where Vincent and Elena were still lingering. "You don't," she said after a pause. "But that doesn't mean you don't deserve them." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. Evelyn was one of the few people who truly understood her, who saw beyond the polished veneer to the steel beneath. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I'll be fine. I always am." Evelyn hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but before she could, a ripple of movement near the staircase drew their attention. Vincent was finally making his way into the room, Eleanor at his side. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea, eyes tracking their every move. Margaret felt Evelyn's hand brush against hers, a silent show of solidarity. "Do you want me to—" "No," Margaret said firmly, cutting her off. "This is my house, my party. I'll handle it." Evelyn nodded, though her lips tightened in disapproval. "Just remember, you don't owe him anything, not grace, not dignity, not a single ounce of your composure." Margaret didn't respond. She simply took another sip of champagne and stepped forward, weaving her way through the crowd toward Vincent and Eleanor. Her guests turned to look at her as she passed, their conversations faltering mid-sentence. She could feel their eyes on her, 1,000 tiny pinpricks of curiosity and pity. When she reached them, Vincent was in the middle of speaking to one of the board members of the Leighton Foundation, a tall man with a sharp suit and a sharper tongue. The board member's gaze darted to Margaret as she approached, his expression instantly shifting from amusement to unease. "Margaret," Vincent said smoothly, as if this were any other evening and nothing at all were out of place. "I was just introducing Eleanor to Peter." "You remember Peter, don't you?" Margaret barely glanced at Peter. Her eyes were fixed on Vincent, sharp and unyielding. "Of course," she said, her voice as calm as ever. "Peter, it's lovely to see you." Peter fumbled for a response, clearly uncomfortable with the tension radiating from her. "You as well, Margaret," he said hastily. "You've outdone yourself with the gala this year. Truly spectacular." "Thank you," Margaret replied, her tone polite but cool. "I do try." Vincent shifted slightly, the only outward sign that he felt the weight of her presence. "Eleanor has been dying to see the terrace," he said, his voice laced with false cheer. "I was just about to show her. I'm sure she'll find it enchanting." Margaret interrupted smoothly. She turned her attention to Eleanor, who had been standing silently at Vincent's side, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "The view is lovely this time of year." Elena's lips parted, as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. Her gaze met Margaret's for a brief, charged moment, and Margaret saw something there. Hesitation, doubt, maybe even shame. "Thank you," Elena managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret inclined her head, a regal gesture that left no room for further conversation. "Enjoy the evening," she said, her words directed at both of them, though her eyes remained locked on Vincent. There was no warmth in her tone, no pretense of hospitality. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, her chin held high. The crowd seemed to part for her again, an unspoken acknowledgement of her command over the room. She didn't look back, didn't allow herself to see the expressions on their faces. She reached the center of the ballroom and stopped, scanning the room with a practiced eye. Her guests were still buzzing with quiet speculation, but she didn't care. Let them talk. Let them wonder. Tonight wasn't about them. It was about her, and she wasn't finished yet. Margaret moved through the ballroom like a queen surveying her court. She nodded at familiar faces, accepted compliments on the event, and engaged in brief, calculated conversations, all while keeping one eye on Vincent and Elena. They were making their way toward the terrace now, Vincent's hand lightly grazing Elena's back. Margaret noted how the girl flinched slightly at his touch, her movements awkward and hesitant. It was a small detail, but Margaret catalogued it. There was more to this girl than she had initially assumed. "Margaret!" A voice interrupted her thoughts, warm and overly familiar. She turned to find Charles Whitmore approaching, his broad smile and booming presence impossible to ignore. Charles was an old friend of Vincent's, the kind of man who thrived on gossip, but masked it behind an air of joviality. "Charles," Margaret greeted, her smile polite but restrained. "How nice of you to join us this evening." "As if I'd miss it," he replied, chuckling. "You've truly outdone yourself this year. The ballroom looks magnificent as always." "Thank you," she said, her tone measured. She knew what was coming next. Charles leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I couldn't help but notice Vincent's companion this evening. Quite a bold move, don't you think?" Margaret didn't flinch. She sipped her champagne, allowing the moment to stretch just long enough to make Charles uncomfortable. "Boldness has always been one of Vincent's defining traits," she said finally, her tone neutral. Charles laughed, though it sounded forced. "Well, I suppose that's one way to put it. Still, I can't imagine what he was thinking. Bringing her here, of all places." Margaret met his gaze, her eyes cold and unyielding. "What Vincent does or does not think is hardly my concern, Charles. If you'll excuse me, I see someone I need to speak with." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him flustered and muttering into his champagne. The exchange left a bitter taste in her mouth, but she refused to dwell on it. Charles was a parasite, feeding on the drama of others. He didn't deserve her energy. Margaret's gaze swept the room again, searching for Eleanor. She found her on the terrace, standing alone by the balustrade. Vincent was nowhere in sight. For a brief moment, Margaret considered letting the girl be, but something pulled at her, a quiet, insistent voice telling her that this was a moment that mattered. She handed her empty glass to a passing waiter and made her way toward the terrace. The cool night air hit her as she stepped outside, a welcome relief from the warmth of the ballroom. Eleanor didn't notice her at first, her eyes fixed on the city lights in the distance. She looked smaller out here, more vulnerable, as if the weight of the evening had finally begun to sink in. "You'll catch a chill," Margaret said, her voice soft but steady. Eleanor turned, startled. For a moment, she looked like a child caught sneaking a cookie from the jar. "Mrs. Layton," she stammered. I didn't mean to—" "There's no need to explain," Margaret interrupted, her tone calm. She stepped closer, resting her hands lightly on the edge of the balustrade. The city stretched out before them, glittering and endless. "It's a beautiful view, isn't it?" Elena nodded, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "It is." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the party fading into the background. Margaret studied the girl out of the corner of her eye. Up close, she could see the cracks in the polished exterior, faint smudges of mascara beneath her eyes, a slight tremor in her hands. She wasn't the confident seductress Margaret had imagined. She was scared and young, far too young. "Why are you here?" Margaret asked finally, her voice quiet but firm. Elena blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. Vincent invited me." "That's not what I asked." Margaret turned to face her fully now, her gaze piercing. "Why are you here, Elena? Why did you agree to come to this party knowing what it would mean?" Elena's lips parted, but no words came out. She looked down at her hands, her cheeks flushing with shame. "I don't know," she whispered. I thought I wanted to." "And now?" Eleanor hesitated, her eyes brimming with tears. "Now I don't know." Margaret sighed, a sound that was more weary than angry. She hadn't expected honesty, but it was clear that this girl was as lost as she was complicit. "Do you know what this event represents?" Margaret asked, her tone softening slightly. "What it means to me, to the people here tonight." Eleanor shook her head, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I didn't think about that. I didn't think about anything." "No," Margaret said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You didn't." Another silence fell between them, heavier this time. Margaret looked back out at the city, her mind racing. She had come out here to confront this girl, to stake her claim and make her understand the damage she had caused. But now, standing here with her, she felt something unexpected. "Pity, Eleanor," Margaret said quietly, her voice almost gentle. "You don't belong here." Eleanor looked up at her, her eyes wide and filled with something Margaret couldn't quite name. "I know," she whispered. Margaret nodded, satisfied. "Then do something about it." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked back inside, leaving Eleanor alone on the terrace. She didn't know if the girl would heed her words, but for now, it was enough. Margaret had played her part. The rest was up to Eleanor. Elena remained on the terrace long after Margaret had gone. The city lights blurred in her vision as she blinked back tears, her fingers gripping the cold stone of the balustrade. She felt exposed, as though Margaret's piercing gaze had stripped away the armor she had so carefully constructed for herself. It wasn't just the humiliation of being confronted, it was the unbearable weight of truth that Margaret had so effortlessly laid at her feet. She had no idea how long she stood there, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from the ballroom fading into a dull hum behind her. Her mind reeled with questions she couldn't answer. Why had she agreed to come tonight? Why had she allowed herself to become part of Vincent's life, knowing the destruction it would bring? And why, above all, did Margaret's words haunt her so deeply? The terrace door creaked open, and Elena tensed. She turned, half expecting Vincent, but instead found herself face to face with Claire, Margaret's assistant. The older woman had a sharp, no-nonsense air about her, but her expression softened when she saw Elena's tear-streaked face. "I shouldn't be out here alone," Claire said, stepping closer. Her tone wasn't unkind, but it carried an edge of authority. "I needed air," Eleanor murmured, turning back toward the city. Claire joined her at the balustrade, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "Do you know how many women I've seen come and go in Vincent Layton's life?" she asked, her voice low and calm. "Too many to count." Eleanor stiffened, unsure how to respond. She didn't want to hear this, didn't want to be lumped in with some long line of faceless women who had made the same mistakes she had, and yet she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Claire continued, her gaze fixed on the skyline. "Most of them think they're special, that they're the exception, that Vincent will leave his wife, change his ways, become the man they want him to be." She glanced at Elena then, her expression unreadable. "But he never does." Elena's throat tightened. "I didn't ask to be lectured," she said softly, though there was little conviction in her voice. "I'm not lecturing you," Claire replied. "I'm giving you a chance to decide who you want to be, because right now you're standing at a crossroads. You can either keep going down this path or you can turn around and walk away." Elena didn't respond. She stared at the glittering city below, her thoughts churning. She hated how easy it had been for Claire, for Margaret, to see through her, to strip her down to the truth she had been running from. "Do you even know why you're with him?" Claire asked after a moment. "Or is it just the thrill of it all? The money, the power, the attention?" Eleanor shook her head, her voice trembling. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" Claire pressed, her tone softening. "Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like anything worth losing yourself over." Eleanor closed her eyes, the tears spilling over now. She thought of all the times Vincent had promised her the world, the way he had made her feel beautiful and wanted. She thought of the moments when she had convinced herself that what they had was real, that she wasn't just another name on his long list of conquests, but those moments felt so fragile now, as if they might shatter completely under the weight of tonight's revelations. She didn't know what to say to Claire because deep down, she wasn't sure she believed in those promises anymore. "I thought he cared about me," Elena whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "I thought I mattered to him." Claire's expression softened, and for a moment she looked less like Margaret's fiercely loyal assistant and more like someone who understood. "Maybe he does care," she said gently, "but not in the way you deserve. Men like Vincent, they take, Elena. They take, and when there's nothing left, they move on." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. Elena wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the truth was a weight in her chest that she couldn't ignore. She felt small, like a child who had wandered too far from home and gotten lost. Claire placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder, a gesture that felt more maternal than accusatory. "You're young," she said softly. "You still have time to make better choices. Don't waste it on a man who will never give you what you're looking for." Elena nodded slowly, wiping at her tears. She wanted to believe she could walk away, but the thought of starting over was terrifying. Vincent had been her world for so long that she wasn't sure who she was without him. "Thank you," she murmured, though the words felt inadequate. Claire gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze before stepping back. "It's not too late," she said. "But the longer you wait, the harder it gets." With that, she turned and walked back inside, leaving Elena alone on the terrace once more. The night air was colder now, and Elena wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. Claire's words echoed in her mind, mingling with Margaret's piercing question, "Why are you here?" She didn't have an answer, not yet, but for the first time, she realized she needed to find one. Elena glanced toward the ballroom, where the sounds of laughter and music spilled out into the night. Somewhere in that room, Vincent was likely charming another crowd, pretending as though nothing had happened. The thought made her stomach turn. She wasn't ready to face him, not yet, but she knew she couldn't stay out here forever. Taking a deep breath, Elena straightened her shoulders and walked back inside. The warmth of the ballroom enveloped her, but it no longer felt inviting. The crowd of glittering strangers seemed to close in around her, their laughter too loud, their smiles too sharp. She needed air, but not the kind the terrace could offer. She needed to leave. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for the exit, when she caught sight of Margaret across the crowd. The older woman was speaking to a small group of guests, her posture flawless, her smile a masterclass in composure. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Elena felt a strange pang of admiration and envy. Margaret, despite everything, was still standing tall, still commanding the room. Elena looked away quickly, her cheeks burning. She didn't have Margaret's strength, but maybe, just maybe, she could find her own, one step at a time, and the first step, she realized, was leaving Vincent behind. The ballroom's opulence shimmered with an air of blissful ignorance, but Vincent could sense the shift beneath the surface. As he wove through the crowd, exchanging hollow smiles and shaking hands, he felt the undercurrent of whispers that followed him. Eyes lingered on him a little too long, smiles faltered mid-sentence, and he could practically hear the speculation crackling like static in the air. Still, he moved with his signature ease, confident in his ability to command a room. He had weathered storms before. A few raised eyebrows were nothing compared to the deals he'd salvaged, the scandals he'd smoothed over. This was no different, or so he told himself. "Vincent," a man's voice interrupted, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to see Peter, one of the Foundation's board members, standing with a drink in hand and a barely concealed smirk. "Peter," Vincent greeted, his voice smooth. "Enjoying the evening?" "Very much so," Peter replied, his tone light but laced with something darker, "though I must say you've made quite the entrance tonight. Your companion has certainly sparked some interesting conversations." Vincent's jaw tightened, though his smile didn't falter. "I wasn't aware my personal life was of such great interest to the board." "Oh, come now," Peter said with a chuckle, leaning in slightly. "You know how these circles work. People notice things. They talk. It's inevitable. People have always talked," Vincent replied coolly. "It's what they do when they have nothing more productive to occupy their time." Peter's smirk widened. "True, but this feels different. Even Margaret seems, how shall I put it, unshakable but sharper than usual." Vincent's eyes flicked toward the crowd, searching for his wife. Margaret was across the room, standing near the orchestra with Evelyn. She looked radiant, her silver gown catching the light like spun moonlight, her posture regal. If she was rattled, she didn't show it, but Vincent knew her well enough to see the steel beneath the elegance. She was waiting, watching. "Margaret is always composed," Vincent said, his voice even. "It's one of her many admirable qualities." Peter chuckled again, clearly enjoying himself. "Indeed, though I wonder how far that composure will stretch tonight. I'd tread carefully if I were you, old friend." Vincent didn't reply. He had no patience for Peter's insinuations, and he certainly didn't need advice from a man who thrived on gossip. Instead, he offered a tight smile and excused himself, making his way toward the bar. He needed a drink, something to steady the unease that was beginning to creep in. But before he could reach the bar, a flash of crimson caught his eye. Eleanor. She was standing near the edge of the room, looking out of place and uncertain. Her earlier confidence seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a quiet tension that mirrored his own. Vincent crossed the room to her, his stride purposeful. When he reached her side, she turned to him, her eyes wide with something he couldn't quite place. Fear? Guilt? Shame? "Why are you standing here?" he asked, his tone low but firm. "You're drawing attention." Elena swallowed, her gaze darting toward the floor. I needed a moment. I didn't mean to—" "You didn't mean to what?" Vincent interrupted, his patience fraying. "Eleanor, this is not the time to falter. You knew what tonight would entail." Her head snapped up, and for the first time there was fire in her eyes. "Did I?" she shot back, her voice quiet but sharp. "Did I know you'd parade me around like some trophy? That people would look at me like I'm nothing?" Vincent blinked, momentarily thrown. Eleanor had always been compliant, easy to manage. This sudden spark of defiance was unexpected and unwelcome. "Lower your voice," he said, his tone hardening. "You're making a scene." "No," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "You're making a scene, bringing me here, to her party. What did you think would happen? That everyone would just pretend not to notice?" "I brought you here because I wanted you here," Vincent said sharply, "because I thought you could handle it." "Well, maybe I can't." Elena's voice rose slightly, drawing a few curious glances from nearby guests. She immediately looked away, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Vincent exhaled slowly, his frustration simmering. "This is not the place for this conversation," he said, his voice low and controlled. "We'll talk about this later." Eleanor shook her head, her expression pained. "There's nothing to talk about, Vincent. You've already made it clear where I stand, and it's nowhere near where I thought I'd be." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Vincent watched her go, his jaw clenched. For the first time that evening, he felt the threads of control slipping from his grasp. He turned back toward the bar, his movements slower now. The cracks were forming, and he could feel them widening. Margaret's icy composure, Elena's defiance, the whispers that followed him like shadows. It was all beginning to unravel. And for the first time, Vincent wondered if he could hold it together, or if he even wanted to. Elena didn't stop walking until she was clear of the ballroom. The low hum of music and conversation faded as she moved down a quiet hallway lined with oil paintings and soft golden light. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she needed to get away. Her pulse raced, her mind a tangle of thoughts she couldn't untangle. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, the sound echoing in the stillness. When she reached the end of the hallway, she found a small alcove with a velvet bench and an enormous window overlooking the gardens. The moonlight spilled through the glass, bathing the space in a soft silver glow. She sank onto the bench, her breath shallow. Her hands trembled as she clasped them in her lap. The conversation with Vincent replayed in her mind, his sharp tone, his condescension, his inability to see her as anything more than an accessory to his life. She had felt invisible standing next to him, like a prop for his ego. But it wasn't just tonight. It had been that way all along. She just hadn't wanted to see it. "Pull yourself together," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. But the tears came anyway, hot and silent, streaking her carefully applied makeup. She pressed her palms to her face, feeling the weight of her choices crushing down on her. "Elena," a voice called softly. She froze, her hands dropping to her lap. Slowly, she turned to see Margaret standing at the end of the hallway. She looked as poised as ever, her silver gown catching the light like armor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension was palpable, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Margaret stepped closer, her heels silent on the carpeted floor. "I thought I might find you here," she said, her tone calm but laced with something Elena couldn't quite place. Sympathy? Disappointment? It was impossible to tell. Elena quickly wiped at her face, her movements frantic. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to—" "Stop," Margaret interrupted gently, raising a hand. "You don't need to explain." Eleanor looked down at her lap, ashamed. "I shouldn't have come. I never should have let him convince me." Margaret was silent for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer. "Why did you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Why had she come? Why had she stayed with Vincent, knowing it could only end in humiliation? The answer seemed so obvious now, but saying it out loud felt impossible. Margaret lowered herself onto the bench beside Eleanor, leaving a polite distance between them. She folded her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on the moonlit gardens outside. "I know what he's like," she said quietly. "I know how charming he can be, how persuasive, and I know how easy it is to believe the things he says." Elena turned to her, surprised. Margaret's voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of pain, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. For the first time, Elena saw Margaret not as the unshakable figure she presented to the world, but as a woman who had endured more than she let on. "I thought he loved me," Elena admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I thought." Margaret gave a small, sad smile. "He has a way of making you believe what you want to believe. It's one of his greatest talents and his greatest flaws." Elena felt a lump rise in her throat. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't think about what this would do to you, to anyone." Margaret turned to her then, her expression unreadable. "No one sets out to hurt someone, Elena, but intentions don't erase the consequences." Elena nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. "I don't know who I am anymore," she confessed. "I thought being with him would make me feel important, special, but now I just feel empty." Margaret studied her for a long moment before reaching into her small clutch and pulling out a handkerchief. She handed it to Elena, who accepted it with shaking hands. "The important thing," Margaret said, her voice firm, "is what you do next." Elena dabbed at her eyes, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "You have a choice," Margaret said simply. "You can keep living in his shadow, letting him define your worth, or you can walk away and start over, find out who you are without him." Elena stared at her, the weight of those words sinking in. "It's not that easy," she said quietly. Margaret's smile was faint, almost wistful. "No, it's not, but the hardest things are often the most important." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint music drifting down the hallway. Elena looked back at the gardens, her mind racing. Margaret's words resonated deeply, but the fear of the unknown loomed large. Walking away from Vincent meant walking away from everything she had come to rely on, his money, his influence, his attention, but staying meant losing herself completely. "I don't know if I can do it," she admitted, her voice trembling. Margaret reached over, resting a hand lightly on Elena's. Her touch was warm, steady. "You can," she said firmly. "You just have to decide you're worth it." Elena swallowed hard, her tears blurring her vision. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a small but steady flame in the darkness. She didn't know what the future held, but Margaret was right. She had a choice, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to choose herself. The ballroom buzzed with laughter and conversation as Margaret re-entered, her expression composed, her every movement deliberate. She carried the kind of dignity that dared anyone to question her, the kind that turned pity into awe. The mask she wore had been perfected over years of carefully constructed appearances, and tonight it was her most critical armor. She glanced toward Vincent, who was holding court near the bar, his charm on full display as he laughed with a small group of board members. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked at ease, as though the tension of the evening had simply rolled off his back. She knew him well enough to recognize the cracks, though. His shoulders were too stiff, his smile a little too wide, his laugh just a touch too loud. Vincent always performed best when he was cornered. Tonight his arrogance was his lifeline. Her gaze flicked toward the doorway where Elena had reappeared moments earlier. The younger woman stood near the edge of the room, her back straight, her expression unreadable. For the first time that evening, Elena wasn't hiding. Margaret could see it in the set of her jaw, the way her hands no longer fidgeted with her dress. Whatever had passed between them in the hallway had sparked something in her. Whether it would last, Margaret couldn't say. As Margaret observed her, something unexpected happened. Elena stepped forward, her head held high, and began walking toward the center of the room. Guests turned to watch her, their whispers growing louder as they noticed her approach. Margaret felt a flicker of apprehension. She hadn't expected this. Elena stopped near the orchestra, where a microphone stood unattended. The band had taken a brief pause, leaving the room eerily quiet as the guests began to sense that something unusual was about to happen. She reached for the microphone, her hand trembling slightly as she adjusted it to her height. "Excuse me," Elena began, her voice wavering but audible. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. The weight of their stares was palpable, but she stood her ground. I need to say something." Margaret's breath caught. She resisted the urge to step forward, to intervene. This was Elena's moment, for better or worse. Vincent turned sharply, his face darkening as he realized what was happening. He began to move toward her, but Margaret intercepted him, placing a hand lightly on his arm. "Let her speak," she said quietly, her tone brooking no argument. "Elena," Vincent called, his voice low and tense. "This isn't the time." "It is," Elena said, her voice gaining strength. She looked directly at Margaret, then at the crowd. I owe someone here an apology, and not just her but all of you. The room was utterly still. Margaret could feel the tension thrumming in the air like a live wire. Elena's words were halting at first, but as she continued, her voice steadied, her resolve solidifying before their eyes. I came here tonight because I let myself believe in something that wasn't real, Elena said, her gaze sweeping the room. I thought that being with Vincent Layton would make me feel important, that it would give my life meaning, but all it did was hurt people who didn't deserve it. A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd, but Elena didn't falter. Her eyes locked on Margaret's, and for a moment it was as though no one else existed in the room. Mrs. Layton, she said, her voice breaking slightly, I'm so sorry. I didn't think about what I was doing, or how it would affect you. I let myself be part of something I had no right to be part of. You deserve better. Margaret's chest tightened. She hadn't expected this. Not the raw honesty, not the humility. It was far from perfect, but it was real, and in a room full of artifice that counted for something. Elena turned her attention back to the crowd, her voice firm now. I'm leaving tonight. I won't be part of this anymore. And I hope that one day I can look back on this and know I did the right thing, even if it's too late to undo the harm I've already caused. With that, she placed the microphone back on its stand and stepped away. The silence in the room was deafening, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Elena's gaze briefly met Margaret's again, a silent question lingering in her eyes. Margaret inclined her head ever so slightly, an acknowledgement, though she wasn't sure what it meant. Vincent's face was a thundercloud as he stepped forward, his hand reaching for Elena's arm. But before he could say anything, Margaret moved between them. Let her go, she said quietly, her voice calm but resolute. Vincent hesitated, his hand falling to his side. For the first time that evening, he seemed truly at a loss. Eleanor didn't wait for him to recover. She turned and walked toward the exit, her step steady, her head high. The room parted for her like the sea, the whispers growing louder in her wake. Margaret watched her go, a strange sense of relief washing over her. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was something, a beginning. As the doors closed behind Elena, Margaret turned back to the room. The guests were watching her now, their curiosity mingled with unease. She straightened her shoulders, her gaze sweeping over them like a queen surveying her court. Well, she said, her voice crisp and commanding, I believe we've all had enough excitement for one evening. Please, enjoy the rest of the party. The orchestra, sensing their cue, began to play again, the soft strains of a waltz filling the air. Slowly, hesitantly, the guests began to move, the tension in the room dissipating like smoke. But Margaret knew that tonight would linger in their minds and in their whispers for a long time to come. As she turned toward the bar, she caught Vincent watching her, his expression unreadable. She didn't give him the satisfaction of holding her gaze. Instead, she walked past him, her step steady, her head high. Tonight had been a turning point for all of them, and Margaret wasn't done yet. The soft strains of the orchestra filled the room, but the music was merely background noise to the tension that lingered like smoke in the air. Margaret moved with practiced elegance, her posture impeccable as she approached the center of the room. Conversations had resumed, but the guests' laughter was more subdued, their gazes darting toward her and Vincent in quick, furtive glances. She could feel the weight of their curiosity, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. What will she do now? Margaret ignored them. Her grip on her champagne flute was light, but her focus was razor-sharp. She knew that every move she made tonight would be dissected, analyzed, turned into fodder for whispered conversations, and she would give them nothing except the image of a woman in absolute control. Vincent, however, was unraveling. She could see it in the way he stood near the bar, his hand gripping his drink as though it were an anchor. His polished charm had dulled, his easy confidence replaced with a simmering frustration he was struggling to hide. He wasn't used to being outmaneuvered, and tonight he had been twice. First by Elena's public confession, and now by Margaret's unwavering poise. Margaret let him stew. She had no intention of approaching him. Not yet. Let him feel the consequences of his actions. Let him understand, if only for a moment, what it meant to be powerless. Mrs. Layton, a voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Evelyn Sinclair approaching, her expression equal parts admiration and concern. Evelyn held 2 glasses of champagne and handed one to Margaret without waiting for her to ask. Well, Evelyn said, her voice low enough that only Margaret could hear. "If I weren't already your greatest admirer, tonight would have sealed the deal." "The way you handled that, it was masterful." Margaret accepted the glass with a small, grateful nod. "It wasn't planned," she admitted, "but sometimes the best performances are the ones we don't rehearse." Evelyn chuckled softly, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "They'll be talking about this for years, you know. What happened tonight, what she said, how you handled it, it's already legend." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. "Let them talk," she said. "They always do." Evelyn hesitated, her gaze flicking toward Vincent. "And him? What are you going to do about him?" Margaret's smile didn't waver, but her grip on the glass tightened slightly. "Nothing," she said calmly. "Not tonight." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You're letting him off the hook?" "Hardly." Margaret's tone was ice-cold. "But tonight isn't about him. It's about me, and I won't let him take that from me." Evelyn studied her for a moment, then nodded in approval. "You're stronger than I would have been," she said. "If it were me, I'd have thrown my drink in his face and walked out." Margaret allowed herself a small laugh. "That would be satisfying, wouldn't it?" She glanced toward Vincent, her expression unreadable. "But satisfaction and strategy are rarely the same thing." Evelyn gave a knowing smile. "Well, if you ever decide to write a book on how to handle a scandal, let me know. I'll be your first reader." Margaret tilted her glass in a silent toast, then excused herself. She had no desire to linger in one spot for too long, no desire to give anyone the impression that she was cornered or rattled. She moved through the crowd with purpose, exchanging polite words and accepting compliments on the evening. The whispers followed her, of course, but she ignored them. Finally, she made her way to the far side of the ballroom, where the terrace doors stood open. The cool night air called to her, but she resisted. Instead, she paused at the edge of the room, her gaze sweeping over the scene before her. The guests were still milling about, their conversations a mixture of awkward politeness and thinly veiled gossip. The orchestra had struck up another waltz, and a few couples had ventured onto the dance floor, their movements stilted and self-conscious. Vincent stood near the bar, speaking to Peter and a few other board members. He laughed at something one of them said, but the sound rang hollow. Margaret watched him for a moment, a strange mixture of pity and disdain tightening in her chest. Once, she had loved him. Once, she had believed in him. But now, all she felt was a cold detachment, as though she were watching a stranger rather than the man she had shared her life with. Her gaze shifted to the ballroom's grand chandelier, its crystals glittering like frozen stars. This was her world, she realized, not his. She had built it, shaped it, made it her own, and tonight she had reclaimed it. Taking a deep breath, she turned back toward the crowd. There was still work to be done, appearances to maintain, alliances to strengthen, but for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was taking control. The gala officially ended hours ago, but the house still hummed with the remnants of the evening. Staff bustled quietly, clearing glasses and sweeping the ballroom's marble floors, their movements efficient and practiced. Margaret sat alone in the study, a glass of cognac untouched on the table beside her. The room, with its rich mahogany shelves and soft lamplight, had always been her retreat, a place where she could think without the constant scrutiny of others. Tonight, the silence felt different. It wasn't comforting, it was weighted, filled with the echoes of everything that had happened. She leaned back in the leather armchair, her gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. Her mind replayed the events of the night in vivid detail, Elena's trembling confession, the stunned faces of the guests, Vincent's growing unease as he realized how thoroughly the narrative had slipped out of his control, and finally Elena's exit, a moment that had felt oddly triumphant even for Margaret. A quiet knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She straightened, smoothing her dress out of habit. "Come in." The door opened, and Claire stepped inside. She carried a clipboard tucked under one arm, her usual air of efficiency softened by something more tentative. "I thought you might still be awake," Claire said. "Do you mind?" Margaret gestured toward the chair opposite her. "Not at all. Sit." Claire closed the door behind her and took a seat, setting the clipboard on the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret sipped her cognac, savoring the warmth as it slid down her throat. "That was quite a performance tonight," Claire said finally, her tone neutral. Margaret arched an eyebrow. "Which one?" "There were so many." Claire allowed herself a small smile. "Elena, for starters. I wasn't expecting that." "Were you?" Margaret shook her head. "No, but she surprised me. In a good way, I think." She left not long after her speech, Claire said. Alone, I saw her get into a cab. Margaret nodded. Good. She needs to be alone for a while, to think. And Vincent? Claire hesitated, her expression cautious. He hasn't left yet. He's in the guest house. Of course he was. Vincent's ability to take up space where he wasn't wanted was practically an art form. Margaret set her glass down and folded her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable. Let him stay, she said after a moment. I'll deal with him in the morning. Claire nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. Are you sure? He's been less than discreet tonight. Margaret's smile was thin and cold. He thrives on attention, Claire. But tonight no one was watching him. Not really, they were watching me. Claire studied her for a long moment, then leaned back in her chair. And what are you going to do now? Margaret's gaze drifted back to the fire. The answer was both simple and impossibly complex. I'm going to make some changes, she said finally. Starting with Vincent. Claire didn't press for details, but her approval was evident in the slight incline of her head. You've handled everything beautifully, Margaret. I hope you know that. Thank you. Margaret's voice was soft, but her resolve was steel. But it's not over yet. Claire rose, picking up her clipboard. I'll leave you to it then. If you need anything, I'll let you know, Margaret finished. Good night, Claire. Good night. Once Claire had gone, Margaret let out a long breath. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. It was past midnight now, the house settling into its quiet rhythms, but she felt no urge to sleep. Instead, she reached for the notebook on the side table, flipping it open to a blank page. Her pen hovered over the paper for a moment before she began to write. Priorities finalized the separation agreement. Meet with the board regarding the foundation's future. Reassess partnerships, both personal and professional. She paused, tapping the pen against the page. The list felt clinical, detached, but it was necessary. If she had learned anything tonight, it was that emotions had no place in strategy, and this, above all, was a strategy. When the list was complete, she set the notebook aside and stood. The room felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in on her. She crossed to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to look out at the garden. The moon hung low in the sky, casting everything in a pale, ghostly light. Somewhere out there, Vincent was likely nursing his wounded pride, crafting his next move. Margaret didn't care. For too long she had let his decisions dictate her life, his actions shape her reputation. No more. The night had been a turning point for everyone. For Elena, who had found the courage to break free. For the guests, who had witnessed a drama they would dissect for weeks. And for Margaret, who had finally reclaimed her power. Tomorrow, she would confront Vincent. She would lay out the terms of their separation with a calm, unyielding resolve, and she would ensure that whatever came next, it would be on her terms. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. The fire crackled softly behind her, the warmth brushing against her skin. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, Margaret felt prepared to walk it, alone, if necessary. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of the estate, its golden rays breaking the quiet stillness of the house. Margaret stood by the dining room table, her fingers resting lightly on a cup of steaming tea. She had always loved the early hours of the day, when the world felt calm and her thoughts were clearest. Today, however, the calm was an illusion. Today was about confrontation. She heard the distant sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. Vincent. She didn't look up as he entered the room, his presence heavy and charged with the remnants of the previous night. He cleared his throat, but Margaret didn't acknowledge him immediately. Instead, she took a slow sip of her tea, savoring the warmth before setting the cup down with deliberate precision. Margaret, Vincent began, his voice tentative, almost cautious. We need to talk. Yes, we do, she said, her tone even. She gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. He hesitated but complied, his movements less fluid than usual. The mask of charm he so often wore was absent this morning. Instead, he looked tired, his normally impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. For the first time in years, he seemed unsure of himself. Margaret folded her hands neatly on the table, her gaze steady. I assume you've had time to reflect on last night. Vincent leaned back, exhaling sharply. Margaret, She held up a hand, silencing him. Don't waste my time with excuses, Vincent. What happened last night was entirely your doing, and now we're going to address it. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire to defend himself warring with the realization that he had no defense. I've tolerated your behavior for longer than I care to admit, Margaret continued, her voice calm but unyielding. "I've played the role of the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, all while you've disrespected me and this marriage in ways I can't even begin to count. But last night—" She leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "Last night was a line you should never have crossed." Vincent's eyes flicked to hers, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Margaret's lips curved into a bitter smile. "Didn't you? Bringing her here, to my event, in front of my friends and colleagues, that wasn't a mistake, Vincent. That was a choice. And now I'm making mine." He straightened in his chair, his brows furrowing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this marriage is over," Margaret said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I've already spoken with my attorney. The papers will be ready by the end of the week." For a moment, Vincent looked stunned. Then his expression hardened. "You're serious?" "Entirely." His fists clenched on the table. "Margaret, think about what you're doing. The foundation, the business, everything we've built together." Margaret let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Everything I've built, Vincent. You've coasted on my reputation, my connections, my work, and I'll be damned if I let you drag any of it down with you." He opened his mouth to argue, but she cut him off. "You'll retain your share of the assets," she said firmly. "I'm not interested in stripping you of your wealth or your dignity, but you will leave this house, and you will leave me." Vincent stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "And if I don't?" Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "You will, because if you don't, I'll make sure every one of your indiscretions becomes public knowledge. And trust me, Vincent, the world won't be kind to you once they know who you really are." The room fell silent, the air between them heavy with tension. Finally, Vincent looked away, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You've already made up your mind," he said quietly. "I have," Margaret replied, "and there's nothing you can say to change it." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. For a moment it seemed as though he might lash out, but then he simply shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "You've become quite the strategist, haven't you?" "I learned from the best," Margaret said, her voice sharp. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a life to reclaim." Vincent lingered for a moment longer, as though searching for something, an opening, a weakness, anything he could use to regain control. But Margaret offered him nothing. Finally he turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy against the polished wood floor. When the door closed behind him, Margaret allowed herself a deep breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her tea, but the tremor passed quickly. She had done what needed to be done, and for the first time in years, she felt free. Later that afternoon, Margaret walked through the garden, the sun warm on her face. She paused by the fountain, its gentle trickle soothing against the backdrop of birdsong. This space had always been her sanctuary, but today it felt different, lighter, as though the weight she had carried for so long had finally been lifted. She thought of Eleanor, wondering where she was, what she was doing. She hoped the young woman had found the courage to start anew, to build a life for herself outside of Vincent's shadow. Margaret smiled faintly, a flicker of admiration for the girl's boldness. The path ahead wouldn't be easy for either of them, but for the first time, Margaret felt ready to face it. She had spent years living for others, shaping herself to fit their expectations. Now it was her turn, her time, and she intended to make the most of it.